Please welcome George McGovern.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you guys this morning. A couple of comments on the earlier video we saw. The Torriello interview, I wasn't aware that was on the internet. I didn't realize the internet was around when that thing was taken or videotaped. And second point on that, I obviously didn't do my due diligence on scouting out just who Roxanne was and how she conducted her interview, but that is one for the books. I didn't realize that. You got that off the internet, I assume.
Oh, yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that was on there. Yeah, that's scary. And then that football lip reading, and we need to get that down to Bergen County. That would be wonderful to have that. We lack some of the humor that you guys have seen here this morning. I am involved with the NCS chapter in Bergen County and have been involved since its inception. And it's been just a treat for me to be a part of NCS and to journey with a bunch of guys through life and trying to integrate our faith in Christ into our lives, into our family life, work life, whatever. My name is George McGovern. I'm no relation to a former politician by the same name. I usually tell people today, if they ask me if I'm any relation, I usually say, you're giving away your age, because you have to be at least 50 years old now to remember that he ran against Richard Nixon in 72. I was a freshman at American University in 1972. American is in Washington, D.C., and it was quite a first semester for me. That was the campaign was in full swing. It was September, October, leading into November of the 72 election. And so I often got asked if I was the son of the Democratic candidate. And I remember one time calling home back in the days when the dorm hall phone was the way that you called home. And you'd call collect, obviously. And I remember one time calling collect, and the operator said, "Who may I say is calling?" And I would say, "This is George McGovern." And she said, "Oh, is this the George McGovern?" And I would say, "No, this is a George McGovern." But professors would send out the attendance roster in a class that semester, and I would put my name on the attendance roster. And one of the professors, after receiving the roster back in his hands, looked it over quickly, and then I remember him saying, "All right, who's the wise guy that put George McGovern down on this attendance roster?" So it had its moments that semester for me. It worked out well in terms of the social side. Usually those young ladies didn't forget my name, once I introduced myself. But it had its troubling moments as well. I do serve with Athletes in Action in the New York metropolitan area. I serve as chapel leader, as Peter so artfully displayed, with the two teams, the Giants and Yankees. Although I didn't start there, I think Peter mentioned that I started with the Jets and the Mets. 1990. You might remember, if you're a Mets fan, 1990, Davey Johnson was the manager. They had just come out of those late 80s when they'd won in 86. They were good in 87, 88. They started to wane after that. But I got to the Mets at a rough time, and they went through, I believe, 4 managers in the 6 years that I was there with the Mets. David Johnson, Buddy Harrelson, Jeff Torborg, if you remember him, and then Dallas Green, I believe, was the last manager before I switched. And I didn't catch the Jets at a good time either. 1990, they just hired Bruce Coslett as their manager, and he lasted 4 years. Then Pete Carroll came in for 1 year. Dan Marino did the old spike fake and threw a pass for a touchdown in a game that put us out of the playoffs that year, the last game of the season. And Pete Carroll, Mr. Hess fired Pete Carroll basically because of that play, and hired Richie Kotite, which was not Mr. Hess's best decision of his business career. But Richie took us from, I think we were 7-9 under Pete Carroll. Richie took us to 2-14, and that was my last year with the team. So the Jets, my Jets experience was not a good one. I've learned over the years that if you take credit for the wins, you've got to take responsibility for the losses, and I did not want to go there with the two teams that I had been working with in those early 90s. But I was asked to switch over to the Yankees and Giants in 1996 and have been in that capacity and I caught the Yankees at a great time. You guys who follow the Yankees, 96, Joe Torre came in, Girardi, Derek was in his first full year, and it was quite a run to watch them win 4 out of 5 World Series. And they had Pettit on the team, Mariano, they had Scott Brocious at third base, Paul O'Neill in right field. They had a good group of Christian men on the team. And not that the number of Christians equates to wins necessarily, but there was some great chemistry going on in that clubhouse that I believe lent toward a successful team atmosphere that they obviously had some of the best players in baseball on the team as well. That doesn't hurt. Like Parcells used to say, you know, I don't care what the guy prays about or if he prays or not, just give me a 340-pound offensive lineman who can, you know, run a 4.8 40 and he can do whatever he wants in his private life, you know. But they had some great players. So I caught the Yankees at a good time, and then the Giants. I've caught them at a fairly good stretch of years under Dan Reeves was the first manager that I was under. His last year was my first year with the Giants, and then Coach Fossil, and now Coach Coughlin for the last 12 years. I think Tom Coughlin's got the longest tenured stay in the NFL as far as head coach right now, and it's been a real stabilizing influence in the organization, and I've benefited from that in a lot of ways in doing my chapel work. I am not. I'm sure I would not have been the first pick of the litter in terms of chapel leaders for any of those teams. My story, my background would not put me noticeably in a place where I would be considered qualified for a position like this. And I wanted to share some of my story with you this morning. I am from Bergen County, New Jersey, grew up there, attended American University, graduated from American University. But if you were to summarize my growing up and young adult years, growing up in New Jersey in those first few months in college, a good way to summarize my growing up years would be a typical average follower who experienced a crisis that changed his life. A typical average follower who experienced a perceived crisis that literally changed my life. I want to elaborate on these 4 descriptions: typical, average, follower, and then that perceived crisis, just for a few minutes to kind of outline my story. First, I was typical. I was a typical kid growing up in New Jersey. My father was a small business owner, commuted for 40 years to Brooklyn, New York. My mom was a homemaker who ran the house. She was a homemaker, ran the house, loved her husband, and gave her life up for her kids. I was the oldest son, second child of 7, in a home that gave but token experience to the church. But because of my parents' backgrounds, they had embraced the Judeo-Christian worldview, namely the importance of work, the importance of family, and respect for authority. I teased my siblings. I loved McDonald's hamburgers. I ate Hostess Twinkies. I watched a lot of TV, tried to get away with as much as I could, and I played sports. I was a typical kid growing up in New Jersey. Secondly, I was average. I made average grades in school, and I was an average athlete. Now, in my world, average athlete meant, for me, interpreted, I played the offensive line in Pee Wee football. That means you're average. I batted 5th on my Little League team, average. And I was one of the kids coming off the bench in rec basketball growing up. I was an average athlete. In addition, I wasn't on top of the girls' list in high school. Again, I was average. I never made much of an impression, no matter what situation I was in growing up. For instance, I can remember our 10th grade English teacher writing a poem about his class. I was a part of that class. The poem consisted of a description or unique attribute of each of the students in his class. I was the only one he left out, forgot to put into the poem. However, anonymity has its benefits. There was a time in high school when a friend and I skipped out on a class, and the teacher only noticed that my friend was missing from the class. So I was definitely all but nothing but average. Part of the issue of my being average was that I never set any goals as a kid, particularly in high school. I gravitated to taking life as it came rather than shaping my life as I went. I bounced from one sport to another, and this, plus my mediocre athletic abilities, resulted in a lack of proficiency in any one sport. The only varsity letter I earned in high school was a letter when I played high school golf. Now, playing golf in the early 70s and getting a letter in high school was the equivalent to being on the chess team. You know, it just wasn't one of those sports that the girls really admired you being a part of and playing. The only goal I remember setting in high school was to win the most popular guy award for the senior class. Our senior class gave out different awards for different character or ambitious issues. And I had set the goal to win the most popular guy award for the senior class. And my strategy to win this award was to be everybody's friend. And during those high school years, I worked hard at being everybody's friend. And it was a big disappointment when I found out I couldn't even win that sucker. And then I was a follower. I was typical, I was average, and I was a follower. When I was in high school, I hung around with a bunch of guys, and we called ourselves the Gusto guys. We were cool. You might remember that beer commercial, the Schlitz beer commercial back in the late 70s. It said, you only go around once in life, and so you've got to grab for all the gusto you can. And that was our motto that we adopted. I was not one of the leaders of the Gusto guys. I didn't come up with the motto. Rather, I joined in on the activities. I followed the direction that was set by the pace setters within the Gusto guys. I wanted to be accepted as a member of the group. I can remember one night getting drunk with these guys and someone in this group deciding that we needed to knock down the fence that the high school baseball coach had put up to keep the fellows on the bench from talking to the young ladies in the bleachers nearest the bench. And so the coach put up this fence. And so we trudged over to the high school athletic field and knocked down the fence that our coach had put up. And although I knew that what we were doing was wrong, the drive to be accepted and embraced by this group of guys was stronger, and so it carried me into that kind of activity. One of the downsides about being a follower is that you are easily led down wrong paths. The mantra, everybody is doing it, can becomes a rallying cry, and it can lead to all sorts of misfit behavior. In addition to consuming alcohol every weekend and often driving under the influence, I also picked up the habits of smoking cigarettes, learning about love in the back of a car, and lying to cover my tracks. Over a high school Christmas break, the Gusto guys convinced me to drive them up to our family vacation home in Pennsylvania so that we could do some binge drinking, try to rendezvous with some young ladies, and steal some of the resort's signage. My upbringing, which emphasized honesty and decency, was being diluted, and my heart was becoming hardened as I went along through those high school years. Well, living as a typical, average follower persisted into the first few weeks of my freshman year in college at American University. I joined a beer drinking fraternity, picked up my books as little as possible, and I looked to assimilate into the college social culture. My girlfriend, who was a junior in high school at the time, came down for a September weekend, and it was about a month later that my perceived crisis came into view or occurred. It came in the form of a letter from my girlfriend back home. She wrote to say that she thought she was pregnant and wondered what we should do about it. As I read the letter, my world began to shake violently. I was 17, my girlfriend was 15. I was in no way prepared to handle the responsibility of a family. So to make emotional matters worse, I was coming to the conclusion during those first few weeks of college that this young lady, my girlfriend, and I had no future together. I can remember after reading the letter, grabbing a bag of golf balls and my 9-iron, walking across campus, the other side of campus, to a field, and I thought I would shag a few balls, just hit a few golf balls, just to try to do something while I was processing in my mind the information I received from my girlfriend and wondering what I should do about it. And I remember after just hitting a few balls, dropping the club, looking up into the sky, and just saying, God, I'm in trouble. I need help. Well, a couple days later, I noticed a poster in my dorm advertising a meeting to be held that evening in my floor lounge, in my dorm floor lounge. The meeting was being sponsored by Campus Crusade for Christ. The word Christ caught my attention, and something inside of me urged me to go to this meeting. Although I knew it was going to be a religious meeting, and I knew I wasn't going to be comfortable, there was something I felt urging me to go to the meeting. So only about 10 students showed up in the dorm lounge for the program. The speaker, Rick, was a former tight end for the University of Miami. He was now on the staff with Crusade. And he gave an interesting talk on the Old Testament and the coming of a Messiah, the prophecy about a Messiah. Although his points were insightful, what struck me the most about Rick and impressed me the most was the way he conducted himself when a few of the students in the room started to ask him distracting questions during his message. There was a peace and a confidence about him that was different than what I was feeling at that moment in my life. I for sure was not at peace, and any confidence I might have had in my life went out when I received that letter a few days earlier. Well, at the end of the meeting, Rick asked us to fill out a comment card and indicate whether we would be interested in receiving more information about what he had talked about. And I struggled for a few minutes in deciding whether or not I should submit that card. I knew if I turned in a card, I'd be inviting that speaker to stop by my room, and I feared getting into a religious conversation because I knew so little about what he had spoken about. And yet, because of Rick's peace and the confidence and the way he handled himself, he was the type of person I needed in my life at that moment to help me process through this crisis I was going through. And so I turned in my comment card with a request for more information. And sure enough, Rick stopped by my room a day or two later. And we got acquainted, exchanged background information, and found out that we had some things in common. Like me, Rick was one of 7 kids. He was the second oldest, like me. His dad was in the trucking business, like my dad was in the trucking business. And he and I both aspired to one day going into business with our dads. Rick exuded a trustworthiness, and he also had that peace and that confidence that I talked about earlier. And so before I knew it, I was telling Rick my story and describing the fear and the helplessness that I was feeling at that time. And Rick listened carefully. He offered some comforting words, but then he changed the conversation to what he said was the root cause of my problem. I heard the story for the first time through Rick of God's provision to forgive me of my sin. I didn't need to be convinced of my need for forgiveness. I needed help. And Rick's presentation of the good news that Jesus loved me, that he died on a cross for my sin, he was raised from the dead, he could come into my life and change me from the inside out, was music to this man's ears. And so that afternoon, early in 1972, November of 1972, during my first semester at college, I bowed my head, but more importantly, I bowed my heart, and I asked Christ to forgive me of my sin, come into my life. Rick and I became friends, and he'd stop by my room regularly to offer help in me growing as a Christian. I asked him a lot of questions, began reading the Bible, and I began to I started the new practice of talking to God and letting him know how I felt. Within a week after becoming a Christian, I received a second letter from my girlfriend with the good news that I was not going to be an 18-year-old father after all. As I continued to grow in faith, I began to experience the peace that I had noticed that had exuded from Rick's life that first night that I met him. It was an inner calmness I was feeling. It was a soulish harmony. I try to describe it that way. There was a serenity in my heart that I had never had before. I also felt clean inside. Throughout my teenage years, I lived with a backdrop sense of guilt and shame for my attitudes, words, actions. Now I was experiencing forgiveness of my sin for the first time, and I was learning how to confess my sin as often as I committed it, and as often as I became aware of it. And this is what gave me those clean feelings. Again, I'd never had that experience before, being a sense of being internally cleansed, if you will. Perhaps the most noticeable change I experienced that could be observed by others was the sense of purpose or direction that was now a part of my mindset. During my teen years, I had wandered through life with no real idea of where I was headed. I was a follower because I had no vision or concept of the purpose under which all smaller purposes fit. I didn't know what God's purpose was for life. The Bible was showing me as I read it that God's ultimate purpose for the human life was for man to love Him, to love others, and to help others do the same. The smaller purposes I found in pursuing a career or in engaging in different relationships could all be placed under the ultimate purpose of loving God and people. So I went from being a follower of men to a follower of Jesus Christ and a leader of men, urging men to come and follow their Savior, to love Him, and subsequently to love others. I mentioned at the outset that an accurate summary of my growing up and young adult years was typical, average, follower. That summary would no longer be accurate. My life is anything but typical now. Instead of average, God motivates me to seek to excel in all that I do by His grace, because of His internal stuff working in my life. I want to be the best I can be as a husband, as a father, as a grandfather, as a missionary, and whatever. And God has also made me a leader, again, by His work in my life. The vision God has given me specifically for the New York metropolitan area has gripped my heart, and it leads me to seek to lead other men to follow Christ, to love Him, to love others, and to help others do the same. I've been fortunate, as was mentioned by Peter and I alluded to, to be with the New York Giants football team for the last 20 years. And in those 20 years, the Giants have gone to 3 Super Bowls. They've won 2 of them. You might remember the first Super Bowl they went to. They went down to play the Baltimore Ravens, Ray Lewis's rookie year, I think, or second year. And as Jim Fossil put it, great season, bad day at the Super Bowl. I think the score was 37-6 or something like that. We were punished terribly that day by the Baltimore Ravens defense. But then later in 2007, you saw the Tyreek catch. That was the Super Bowl. Actually, it was in 2008, but the season of 2007 was a great run, and the Giants found themselves the underdog in every game leading up to the Super Bowl and including the Super Bowl, and then won that game miraculously, you could say. And then 4 years later, they found themselves in the Super Bowl again with the New England Patriots again, and again underdogs throughout the whole playoffs, and won that Super Bowl. Whether we get back again soon or not remains to be seen. But it was 3 remarkable seasons, and I was fortunate to receive rings from those 3 seasons. I brought them with me. This is a NFC Conference Championship ring. This is the ring that the loser of the Super Bowl gets. So the players and coaches, front office, get a conference championship ring. The Giants beat the Vikings that year to go to make it to the Super Bowl. they lost the Super Bowl, so they got their conference championship ring. It's a nice looking ring, but it pales in comparison to the Super Bowl rings. This is the Super Bowl ring that the Giants players, coaches won, beating the New England Patriots the first time. And this was the ring that Michael Strahan called a 10-table ring. A reporter asked him after the game was over, and reporter was asking him about the Super Bowl victory and what kind of ring he wanted, on his finger. And Strahan is reported to have said, "I don't care what it looks like." He said, "I just want a 10-table ring." And the reporter said, "A 10-table ring? What do you mean by that?" He said, "I want a ring so big that someone in a restaurant 10 tables away from me will know that I have a Super Bowl ring on." Classic Strahan comment. And then this ring is the ring that the players and coaches won after the 2012 Super Bowl when they beat the Patriots again in Indianapolis. And the uniqueness about this ring is when Tiffany sat down with Eli and Justin Tuck and Zach Diossi, the three captains of the team, and asked them for input on what they would like to see on the ring, all three of them said, "You've got to put somewhere on the ring the phrase 'all in,' because that was the chemistry maker for the team the last couple of games of the regular season and then on into the playoffs." And if you went to any of those Giants playoff games that season, well, there was only one playoff game at home against the Falcons, but the game prior, the Dallas Cowboy game, last game of the regular season, when they had to win that to make it to the playoffs, the Giants were flashing "all in" on the big jumbotron and whatnot. And the genesis of that phrase was a chapel message given by a friend of mine, John Paul Gonzalez, who talked about being all in our relationship with God. He passed out poker chips and said, "Guys, when you've been dealt a good hand in a poker game and you think you for sure got the right hand to win, you push all your chips in the middle of the room and you say, 'What? I'm all in,' right?" And he challenged the guys to be all in their relationship with God. Well, some of the guys took that phrase to the snack time later on that evening. They started talking to some of the guys who didn't go to the chapel about being all in. They began to relate it to their performance as players and as a team. And that phrase kind of caught on. And in fact, the Giants front office printed up 80,000 rally towels for the Dallas game with the phrase "all in" on the rally towel. They won that game. Atlanta Falcons came for the first playoff game, and they the front office printed up another 80,000 rally towels with "all in" on it, and the Giants went on to win the Super Bowl against the New England Patriots that game. I say all that to say this, that the Giants gave me these rings. I did not do anything to help the Giants win any of those conference championships or Super Bowls. Obviously didn't play, but none of the coaches ever asked me once my opinion on how they should game plan against a certain team. I wanted them to ask me. I had some ideas. Never asked me. And none of the scouts ever called me up and said, "George, who do you think we should draft this year in the upcoming draft? Or who should we sign as a free agent?" Never got those phone calls. I had my opinions, but never was counseled or asked for counsel on that. I did nothing to deserve these rings, and yet the Giants front office, the ownership, out of the goodness of their hearts, gave me 3 championship rings. And I share that story, that illustration, to say this, is that to me it reflects the goodness and the grace of God, that even though we don't deserve forgiveness, even though we don't deserve God's gracious presence in our lives, God, out of his love and grace, initiates a relationship with us. I was not an enemy of the Giants. I was at least a friend of the organization, if not trying to be more than that as a spiritual coach. But the Bible says that even while we were yet enemies, Christ died for us. We weren't friends of God, and he felt good about us, and so he gave us forgiveness. The Bible says even while we were yet sinners, enemies of God, God reached down, sent his only begotten Son to die on a cross for our sins. So I share that because there might be some guys here this morning who are still wrestling with what am I trusting in for the forgiveness of my sin. I learned as a freshman in college that my trust, the basis of my forgiveness was in what God did for me, not in what I do for him. And I received that gift. I think that means I'm done. I received that gift as a free gift. So I would challenge you this morning that if that's where you are this morning, still at that door, not placing your faith and your confidence in what God has done for you, but still looking at something that you're trying to do to get to him, throw that out and embrace the truth that God so loved the world that he gave, and that is by grace that we're forgiven, saved through faith, not as a result of anything that we do ourselves. That was what I wanted to try to share this morning. I hope it encouraged you to keep walking your relationship with God this morning. Thank you very much, Paul.
So just to prove to you that the front office of the Giants is not as gracious as God, I'm a Patriots fan. They didn't send me a ring. We got a few minutes, guys, and instead, I think this morning, instead of breaking into our little tables of 3 and 4 and just talking about George's talk, I got a feeling there are a bunch of guys who would love to ask him some questions about kind of what he does and what he's experienced. So we got about 5 minutes. We'll do some questions, and then I think if you need to leave, feel free to leave. But we'll keep going for a little while after that with some Q&A. So if anybody have a question, I got one in the back, Bill. Hold on.
This isn't a question, but the other couple of weeks ago, saw a movie. Maybe you know the movie. Wallen something. It's a high school name. Does anybody else see it? It
Woodlawn?
took place in 1973-74. It's based on a true story, and it's about how. What did you know the name?
Woodlawn.
Woodlawn. It's really a great movie because a fellow comes in who presents Christ to this team who's trying to integrate. This took place in Birmingham, Alabama, and I know most of you guys are too young to appreciate, and maybe if you come from the South like I did, about what impact this had about presenting Christ to this team, and really not only on the team, but also in the whole city of Birmingham.
So, Bill, we give grace to Bill to not ask a question during question time, but you guys don't get that. So anybody have an actual question?